Good morning. Welcome to the concluding morning of the 54th Munich Security Conference. I'm glad to see so many of you already fully awake. This Sunday morning is going to be devoted almost exclusively to issues pertaining to the Middle East. But we started with our new tradition of having what we call a congressional debate. This congressional debate will be moderated and led by my wonderful friend, Victoria Nuland. Many of you know her. She's been at this conference in her former capacities as an Assistant Secretary of State, as a NATO ambassador for many years. And Victoria Nuland is now the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security. Without further ado, we don't have any time to lose. I'm going to invite Toria up here to introduce her panelists from the U.S. Congress. Tori, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Great to see you. I have a mic. Yeah, thank you. Panelists, go ahead. Good morning, everybody. How great to see everybody bright and shiny on a Sunday morning on day 3 of this conference. We are delighted to have, once again this year, a bipartisan, bicameral group from the U.S. Congress to give you the sense from the legislative branch of what is really going on in the United States. Many of these faces are familiar to you and longtime investors in the Munich Security Conference and in the transatlantic relationship. Before I introduce them, I would simply say that I think in 2017 and 2018, you saw Congress that was even more active than usual on U.S. security issues, on U.S. national interest, foreign policy. We always have an active Congress, but last year was a year where the Congress, concerned about where we would go on U.S. sanctions, decided to legislate them to ensure that they would need to be consulted about any changes in that policy. Last year was also a year where both houses of Congress launched investigations into malign Russian influence in our election process. The Congress is very active, as you know, in working with the executive branch and the president on the future of the Iran deal, which is very important to all of you. And of course, we just passed a very large increase in the defense budget and reassured foreign policy spending and U.S. assistance abroad despite a different set of budget proposals by the administration. So this is a very active crew. Just to introduce them quickly, here we have Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator James Risch, Republican from Idaho, Senator Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat from New Hampshire, and Congressman Mike Turner, Republican from Ohio. We're going to start today with a general question that I will ask of all of the panelists, and then a specific question to each one of them, rather than having the long, boring opening statements that I know you love so much, so that then we can get quickly to the questions, because I know there are a lot of questions. The general question that I'd ask of all of our congressional colleagues, 1 year into the Trump administration, I think you can sense in this hall that there's still quite a bit of uncertainty about where the United States is going, about U.S. leadership, and about whether what we're seeing now from the Trump administration is, as some are arguing, largely a continuity. Maybe the tone has changed, maybe the form of communication is a little bit different, tweets rather than démarches. Never being a fan of démarches, I'm not sure that, That's not an evolution, but that fundamentally, in terms of things like reinforcing our military presence in NATO's east, these kinds of things, we see largely a continuity. So watch what we do, not necessarily what we tweet. But there are others who argue that fundamentally, the US and the president, President Trump, are approaching this relationship completely differently, that they see it less as a family and more as a competitive relationship, particularly on the economic side, that there is a challenge as to whether we, in the absence of getting to 2% or other things, whether the United States should still continue to fill the delta, et cetera. So my general question to all of you as we come down the line and also address the specific questions is, how different is this? Is this a fundamental reorientation of the way the US deals with its allies, the way the US leads, or is this largely continuity, but just with slightly different tonality? So, Senator Whitehouse, I'm going to start with you first to address that question, but I also want to ask you to speak to an issue that I know you've been very active on and that is close to your heart, which is the question of the role state-sponsored corruption as a general matter, is influencing democratic politics now, tied to the larger question of malign influence, propaganda, et cetera. So different or the same, and what about corruption?
Well, to your first question, I'd say that the Trump administration is still making the adjustment from campaign rhetoric to governing, but those who are directly engaged in the governing, like Secretary Mattis or General Scaparrotti here, I think reflect a continuation of a very long-standing United States tradition of support for the Atlantic Alliance, support for NATO, support for freedom, and a strong desire to push back against falsehood with truth, and a strong desire to push back against bullying with teamwork. So I think that is a very strong constant, and I strongly believe that that is the bipartisan message of our delegation, and one of the reasons that we come here. To your second question, I think that one of the things that is important for society right now, there's been the famous Huntington book about the clash of civilizations. To me, the clash of civilizations is between the rule of law civilizations and the autocracy, kleptocracy, and criminal regimes around the world. And I think that it behooves those of us in the rule of law regime to do a much stronger job of policing our borders against the kleptocrats and the criminals and the autocrats, because they want very much to be able to loot their countries and then park their ill-gotten gains behind the protection of rule of law. And when we give them that sanction, we do two things. One, we encourage and enable that kind of behavior, which is immensely harmful in that contest of civilizations. But second, it's a really bad look for us. You know, if you're a farmer in a country that has been looted by some kleptocrat, and what you see in the world is that that person has taken their billions of dollars and gone to our world and is now yachts in the Med and apartments on Fifth Avenue and very little pushback, we become very complicit in all of that. And so I think with the steps that the EU has taken and that the UK has taken to, for instance, get rid of a lot of the shell corporations that enable this stuff is a step that the United States badly needs to model for the sake of our brand and for the sake of our victory in that clash of civilizations.
Excellent. Just to advise the panel that Senator Risch is going on to a couple of other countries, and he's going to have to leave us at about 9:30, so when he storms off the stage, it's not a reflection on you, or I hope a reflection on me, it's a reflection on his airplane. Senator Risch, how much is this continuity? How much is this fundamentally different? How should our European colleagues and allies and others around the world understand it? And then on a specific interest of yours, you've been quite active on the issue of Korea. In the wake of the charm offensive at the Olympics, but also against the backdrop of what appears to be a pretty lively debate inside the US administration about whether we ought to take preemptive action, a bloody nose, whether we ought to deepen down on the diplomatic piece of this, even as we strengthen sanctions globally. How do you view this going forward now, and what role does the US Congress play in this conversation? But please start with different or the same.
First of all, it may surprise you to hear that I'm in full agreement with Senator Whitehouse on his description.
All right, a bipartisan Senate.
Coming along.
No difference. I would say absolute continuity, notwithstanding the occasional rhetoric you hear to the contrary. We all understand, respect, and want to continue the friendship and partnership we have with our North Atlantic partners. I see no difference in that. Turning to North Korea, the answer that I'm going to give is really quite easy to give, although the message is pretty dire. And that is that this is a really dangerous situation that we're facing right now on the Korean Peninsula. I would argue that there's no, from a mass casualty standpoint, there is no more dangerous place on the planet than the Korean Peninsula right now. This is all in the hands of and the mind of a single person, and that, of course, is Kim Jong-un. What he does, what he decides to do, is going to be decisive of how this matter resolves. And it is not going to resolve well if he continues on the course that he is continuing on. The President of the United States has said, and he is committed to, seeing that Kim Jong-un is not able to marry together a delivery system with a nuclear weapon that he can deliver to the United States. He has said that very clearly. That is, our president has said that very clearly. And anyone who doubts the president's commitment to see that that doesn't happen does so really at their own peril. The consequences of that are breathtaking when you think about how this could happen. There is no bloody nose policy. Senator Shaheen and I drilled down with the administration on that, and nobody knows where that came from. It appeared in the national media. The administration says they've never used the term, they've never considered the strategy. There is no such thing. And if you think about it, it absolutely makes sense. If this thing starts, it's going to be probably one of the worst catastrophic events in the history of our civilization, but it is going to be very, very brief. The end of it is going to see mass casualties, the likes of which the planet has never seen. It will be of biblical proportions. Anyone who doubts that this president isn't committed to that, I would suggest that they step back, take a breath, and listen to what he has said, review the facts on the ground. This president has at his fingertips the ability to dispense what he has said he's going to dispense if the North Korean regime, if Kim Jong-un continues down the path that he is going to. The president can do this quickly, and as I said, it is at his fingertips. I respect any opinion that any of you may have regarding what's happened, what should happen, where it's going to go, but please, please don't ignore the facts that are there. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention China's role in this. China has an absolutely critical role in this. The North Korean regime is not going to listen to the United States, probably not going to listen to anyone else, except for the Chinese. The Chinese, of course, had a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather. We all know that's not the situation today. But nonetheless, because of the transfer of goods, China has real control of this and could take control of this. And they don't want this any more than we want this. They don't like this any more than we do. But they have the ability to do something, and much more so, I think, than we do. Let me say that in closing that we have other intelligence information that we can't discuss here, but I can also tell you that there is nothing that is in that intelligence information that in any way takes away from what I've just described for you. So as dire as the message is, I apologize for that, but those are the facts as we see them today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to excuse myself, Doris. So
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Senator Shaheen, on to you. The first overarching question, how much continuity, how much change? What should our colleagues expect going forward? You've been quite vocal in recent weeks about the state of U.S. diplomacy, both your concerns about the hollowing out of the personnel corps, about the budget, but also about whether we are as active as we might be on the diplomatic side, whether it's in the North Korea context, whether it's in the Syria context, et cetera. Are you concerned that the U.S. is taking itself off the field diplomatically? What is your concern?
Well, to the first question, I agree with my colleagues that we're seeing a lot of continuity and a lot of agreement in Congress, both among Republicans and Democrats and with the House and Senate. We passed the sanctions bill against Russia, Iran, and North Korea, I think something like 519-3, if you count both houses. So despite concerns that came out of the White House about that, Congress acted, and we acted almost unanimously. There's also, I think, one of the reasons that there's been a lot of questions about whether our policies have changed or not is because there have been a couple of high-profile issues where this administration has taken a different view than the previous administration. One is the JCPOA with Iran. One is on trade. And I think on both of those, again, there are some differences in Congress, but I think there's a lot more support for continuing our past policies than it might appear from some of the statements. And one of the challenges is that the administration doesn't always speak with one voice. And so sometimes it's hard to figure out where people are. But I think, as Sheldon said, the unanimity comes from those people who are actually operationalizing policy. And those folks, as you heard here from General McMaster, from Secretary Mattis, from the people who have come from Congress and participated, is we continue to believe the transatlantic alliance is very important. As Secretary Mattis said, our allies are critical for us. We support NATO, and in fact, a revitalized NATO is important to all of our security. So I think if you look underneath some of the statements, you'll see that most of the policies are continuing very much as they have in the past. Now, with respect to diplomatic efforts, one of the things we just did in Congress was to pass a budget agreement that increased spending on the military side pretty dramatically. And despite the White House recommendation on funding for the State Department, what we've seen in the last year is that Congress hasn't agreed with that. We have said in a bipartisan way, Lindsey Graham, who was here yesterday, who chairs the Appropriations Committee that funds the State Department, and his colleague on the Democratic side have agreed that we need to continue to support diplomatic efforts. I've been very concerned about the number of diplomats who have left our State Department, and we've been working hard with John McCain, who I'm sorry is not here because I know he would reinforce some of these points to make sure that we are looking at our diplomats, trying to make sure we have a robust State Department and diplomacy. And one of the things that we've heard regularly from Secretary Mattis when he comes before the Armed Services Committee is, if you don't fund diplomacy, then you need to give me more bullets. And we hear that consistently from our military, and I think that's very important. They understand how important diplomacy is and how important it is that we continue to be out around the world supporting efforts to resolve conflicts, to provide economic assistance to people to support humanitarian needs. And I think we will continue to see bipartisan support for that in Congress.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Applause there from our colleagues. Congressman Turner, are you going to make this a reassurance route? How different, how much the same? You in your congressional career have been very active on the subject of nuclear weapons, on the subject of strategic deterrence, former NATO Parliamentary Assembly chair. We have a new nuclear posture review from the administration, which arguably is quite different from what we've seen before. In some of these halls, a little bit of an anxiety about small nukes, about the new response. But then we had General McMaster yesterday making clear that this is not designed to destabilize, it's designed to stabilize. Talk to us about how you see all of that. But first, where are we more broadly?
Right, well, I think it's to be reassuring to everyone that on a bipartisan basis, you hear from all of the speakers a sense of continuity, because as the Trump administration was coming in, you had not only our allies, but really, all the U.S. relationships having some tension or strain as they look to what would be U.S. policy. And on a bipartisan basis, you're hearing continuity. The values are the same, the relationships are the same, the goals and objectives of the United States internationally remain the same. What you do see is this administration willing to put pressure upon the systems to make certain that there are results. Whether it be NATO and the 2%, I mean, we'd spent a significant amount of time talking about increased contributions from our NATO allies and the reticence of the American taxpayer to continue to fund the defense of Europe without a corresponding contribution from NATO. Now we're seeing our NATO allies come to the table and nation after nation making the announcement of their plans and their goals for the 2%. So in other areas, you see that pressure also, whether it be the Iran deal, where the administration has said, yes, we see that Iran is complying, but there are some major flaws in the agreement. One, the agreement's term is short, and secondly, Iran is continuing to pursue its missile technology, which ultimately places the United States at risk. And the administration, rather than wait until the term of the agreement has expired, puts pressure on the system for both our allies and the United States to respond to try to address those issues. Similarly, with Russia and its aggression, the administration is looking to provide arms to Ukraine, a change in the system, providing that pressure and looking to results. On North Korea, the administration, I believe, has correctly said this is an issue that we need to lay at the feet of China. As we all know, there would not be a nuclear North Korea if it wasn't for China. And there's not going to be a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but for China. And so the United States is correctly putting pressure, not only as it looks to how it might address the issue between the United States and North Korea, and certainly showing a willingness to have talks, but raising the issue of China and also saying to our allies, there should be no conversations with China, whether it be trade, whether it be any issues that doesn't go to the issue of China. We need your interaction and your commitment on North Korea. Now, on the nuclear posture review, this is another area where the administration has reflected that there has been a change in the world, not only with Iran and its pursuit of missile technologies, North Korea with its not only nuclear weapons program and its missile program, but also its vocal aggressiveness to its neighbors, openly threatening Japan, openly threatening South Korea and the United States. And then also Russia and China's modernization. The fact that Russia has been found to be violating the INF Treaty and also is continuing to modernize its forces. You have Putin himself overseeing nuclear exercises. Imagine if George Bush or if Barack Obama had overseen a nuclear weapons exercise, the outcry that we would have. This posture, I think, does have a response from the administration. The nuclear posture review shows that the United States is going to reinvest its modernization and make certain that it provides our allies the type of assurances that they need. Now, I think another aspect of the nuclear posture review that's important is that we had given our Department of Defense a cognitive dissonance. We had said we're going to diminish our overall focus on nuclear weapons at the same time we were going to go through modernization. We've now said we're going to firmly commit ourselves to modernization. We're still going to look to diminishing overall nuclear weapons as a threat, but make certain that our capabilities are reassurance to our allies and a deterrence to others who might either threaten the United States or our allies.
Thank you, Congressman. Well, lots of diverse. Do you want to jump in,
Can I
Senator? Yeah.
mention one other kind of strange area of continuity?
Yeah.
Perhaps the most egregious reversal in policy from the previous administration to the Trump administration was on climate change. I see Secretary Kerry here, who was an extraordinary champion of this globally. The Obama administration leaned in very hard to help support the Conference of the Parties and get the Paris Agreement together. And then along came this administration pretending that climate change was a Chinese hoax and basically falling into the political line of the worst elements of the fossil fuel industry. And you haven't seen a whole lot of give on that, but just this week before we got here, the United States published its worldwide threat assessment. And it's got the name of Dan Coates, who was a colleague of ours, not particularly active on environmental issues, right on the cover as Director of National Intelligence. And you flip to page 16, and here's environment and climate change as part of the worldwide threat assessment. So, you know, even in an area where the administration has carved out perhaps the most irresponsible position it could on an issue of global significance, nevertheless, you really can't resist the pressure of fact and science and I guess what the Breitbart crowd would call the deep state, but what many of us would call knowledgeable professionals who've given their lives to these things and actually know what they're talking about and come into the minister and say, here you go. So even on that worst of all issues, there's still a hope for continuity, at least in the deep state.
Well, colleagues, you've now heard our bipartisan, bicameral panel of deep state proud loyalists give broad reassurance about continuity in U.S. leadership and in U.S. policy overall, but hit some of the hottest issues on the docket. So now to the audience, I'm going to start with the spectacular Jeanne Harmon here in the front row, formerly a member of this crew.
Good morning. I want to second something that Shaheen said, which is how sorely John McCain is missed.
Yes.
As someone who was on his CODEL for years and years, and now am still on it as a bystander head of a think tank, his voice, his presence was instrumental in training generations of members of the U.S. Congress on foreign policy issues, and it really feels different to be.
And the U.S. State Department, I would say.
Oh, yes, and the U.S. State Department, too. He had his favorites, you being one, Toria. My question is about Congress's abdication, in my view, from its role in declaring war. I was still there in 2001 and 2002 when we passed the authorizations to use military force in Afghanistan after 9/11 and in Iraq. Whether some people think that was the right or the wrong thing to do, we did it. And we had a debate that involved our country and also that the world listened to on military action we were planning to take. Since then, there have been no AUMFs. The Obama administration requested one early on, but it was basically dead on arrival. And now, when we are involved in numerous military activities around the world, especially in the Middle East, even if our role is more as trainer and to provide air cover, there hasn't been the conversation there needs to be, in my view. So my question is, do you agree? And if Congress were able to have a serious debate on authorizing force in the Middle East, might that provide more coherence for U.S. policy in the Middle East, which I don't think is these days well understood.
Thank you, Jane. I think before we jump into that, maybe we'll take one more so we get as much activity from the audience. I see a gentleman way there in the back. I can't see who it is. Please tell us who you are.
Christopher Marshall, thank you, Victoria. I'm a German journalist, but at the moment I'm the Helmut Schmidt Fellow at the German Marshall Funds in the United States, doing a study on the future of transatlantic relations. It's a pity that Senator Risch is no longer with us, because I was puzzled, or I was surprised by the statement that there has never been discussed a bloody nose strategy. As far as I have witnessed that in Washington, D.C., there was an op-ed in the Washington Post by a certain person, Mr. Cha, who was supposed to become the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, and it was widely discussed also at think tanks. So is that a consensus, that there is no bloody nose strategy? There has never been. I would be interested in the views of the podium.
Well, why don't we just dispense with that very quickly, because we met as a delegation before we came here with General McMaster, and we met down in the classified annex to the Senate, and he said there is no bloody nose strategy, there never has been a bloody nose strategy, and we asked, may we say this publicly? Is it something? He said, absolutely, please do. So we're here to echo General McMaster saying there is not and never has been a bloody nose strategy.
I agree with Sheldon on that. I was in that briefing, and that was very clear from General McMaster. I want to go back to the question that Jane had about the authorization for use of military force, because I'm on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We did take up an AUMF in 2013. We passed it out of the committee. We also, I'm one of the people who voted to take action in Syria, one of about 10 people in the Senate. Those never went to the full floor and never went on to go through the Congress. But I think we have heard from people in the military, from Secretary Mattis, from others, that it would be helpful to have a real debate about a new authorization for use of military force, especially as we're looking at our activities in Syria, in Africa, in other conflict areas, that it would be good for people to know where the country is and to have that public debate. So I continue to support that. I think we need to do that, but so far there hasn't been the political will to do that in Congress.
Congressman Turner.
Well, Jane, you mentioned Senator McCain's leadership. Let me thank you for yours. Not only your leadership when you were in Congress, but your leadership today. You've been a strong voice on international security policy, and I appreciate your continued engagement in that, and that you continue to challenge those who are in Congress with your knowledge of both international security issues and congressional workings. I agree with you. I think that Congress needs to be more engaged in the issue of the use of force. I think Libya is an excellent example. If there had been a debate, if there had been a vote, the outcome might have been different. One of the issues that we were openly saying in the United States Congress as Libya was being pursued is that there was no post-Gaddafi strategy. I think sometimes when you have the debates on use of force, you can also change the outcome, and that outcome, I think, would have been different perhaps in the issue of Libya. I think Congress is playing, though, a very important role, and I want to go back to Senator Shaheen's statement on military funding. We are not only changing the effects of what we've seen in sequestration and the disinvestment, the change in readiness that we've had in the U.S. military, but we actually passed funding levels for defense in the upcoming year that are greater than what was requested in the president's budget, because of such a commitment that we needed to modernize our force, change the issues of readiness, and give our country the tools to be able to reassure our allies and to deter those who might do to harm to either the United States or allies. I think that shift also then with the 2-year deal that we now have shows that the United States is going to stay strong and stay committed, and that I think is also a very important signal to our allies.
And can I add also that part of that effort is to look at the new threats that we have, the threats from cyber, the disinformation that is happening not just in the United States, but in Western democracies from Russia's activities. And so I do think that as part of that funding, we're going to see initiatives that can help us address some of those new threats.
Very good. Next question is from one of the Munich young leaders in the audience, Fyodor Votelovsky.
My name is Fyodor Votelovsky. I work for Institute of World Economy and International Relations of Russian Academy of Sciences. And my question is concerning sanctions. In current model, especially after CATSA law, sanctions have been designed and aimed to become a system of sticks, not carrots, for American adversaries. But it is also having significant impact on the interests of many American allies and partners, and especially on private enterprise. And many compliance offices of European banks and companies have to take into account American legislation before legislation of their own countries. And even in case European sanctions could be lifted, American sanctions will be still there, and they should take them into account. I would like to ask you, do you see it as an equal treatment towards American partners and allies? And does it interfering to the sphere of private enterprise more than politics? Thank you.
Good, let's take one more. I think I see Joe Jaffe, is that who I see? Yeah, good.
I have two quick questions going back into nuclear history for anybody who'd like to take it up. It seems to me certain things are repeating themselves. When Barack Obama pronounced going for a world of global zero, he also asked Congress for $70 billion for the modernization of the stockpile. If we go back farther, into the 80s, we see that so-called low-yield nuclear weapons are also not a new story. In those days, they were called dial-a-yield nuclear weapons. So could anybody here explain to me how these postures are different from how they were in the past?
Can we take these two and then
Can I address the sanctions one briefly?
please jump in?
First of all, I think that sanctions are a very useful tool, particularly with respect to Russia. There is nothing quite like putting pressure on all the capos to make them put pressure on the capo di tutti capo, the
Fancy Italian. This is from Providence, Rhode Island, right?
So I urge the administration to begin implementing the sanctions that we passed in the Senate. I think 98-2, Jeanne, wasn't it?
In the Senate, yes.
It's about as unanimous as the Senate gets. But I also want to make the larger point that it is not inevitable that parliamentary democracy and market capitalism are the theories that prevail. If we're going to make those theories prevail, we have to make them stand for something, and we have to make them work. And I think what the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers have revealed, this shadow economy that enables criminals and kleptocrats to enjoy the benefit of rule of law society while they have pillaged non-rule of law society, is a significant strategic hazard for the brand of parliamentary democracy and market capitalism. So not only do I want to see these sanctions enforced, I would like to see a much broader regime of incorporation transparency and hostility to this effort by people to loot their own countries or conduct their own criminal enterprises and then seek shelter and be given shelter in our rule of law system.
I'm just going to challenge you a little bit and argue counter to type just for fun here. What we often hear from the Russian side and others who are under sanctions is it's one thing when they are executive sanctions and they can be used, raised or lowered as part of a negotiation, but once you legislate them, then we need the full Senate and the full Congress to be ready to take them off, that they've seen this movie before. Jackson Vanik stayed in place for a decade after the issue that it was first put in place for Russian immigration was over. Is this a good thing?
There is flexibility for the executive, as we've seen by the failure of the president to deny shelter to the oligarchs by executing on the sanctions that we passed.
Well, First of all, the sanctions that the U.S. has right now on Russia have to do with Ukraine. And that's an effort that is very strongly supported by the EU. And so we have not yet entered into a sanctions regime under the most recent sanctions that were passed, as Sheldon said, 98-2, so the CATSA regime. Those have not been implemented yet. But I would say to you and to all of you who represent private business, you benefit from free trade, from a world where you can do business in places, from a world that is conflict-free, where we try and keep the bullies from taking over. And so I'm not going to apologize for us putting sanctions on Russia and Iran and North Korea, because they are making the world a much less safe place, and we should be acting all together to address that. And I would say to businesses that are starting to do business with Iran, I think you ought to rethink that, because until they stop their missile activities, until they stop trying to create unrest in the Middle East, in Africa, and other parts of the world, we should not be doing business with them. They need to pay a price for what they're doing. So, thank you.
Congressman Turner, do you want to take on that, or Judge Offe's question about the
You can do the nuclear.
Yes, I'll do the nuclear question, but just one comment on sanctions. I think it does help when there's congressional action because it shows broad support for what the executive is doing. The other aspect is that, you know, Secretary Kerry's here. I think he certainly would attest that without the sanctions on Iran, there wouldn't be an Iran deal today. Sanctions work, and they also, I think, illustrate that those who violate international norms should not be in the international family treated equally. They should not be treated the same. On the nuclear side, you know, there has been a change in the outlook of the world. We're less safe, and the United States certainly has led. We've reduced our stockpile by 85%. With major declarations from the leadership of our country of the goals of a world without nuclear weapons. But during that time period where we had hoped that by leading that others then would follow and we'd have less proliferation of nuclear weapons, we're actually seeing more so. We're seeing Iran, as the Senator was just saying, pursue missile technology that is not for conventional weapons to try to reach the United States. You see North Korea with its nuclear program. And Russia with its modernization, and Russia with its doctrine, use of nuclear weapons to de-escalate. There is no de-escalation with the use of nuclear weapons. And so we have to have a capability that, again, deters so that there's no miscalculation from those who might want to be our adversaries or do either us or our allies harm. To do that, we have to invest in technology, we have to invest in capability, we have to make certain that our nuclear deterrent is credible, reliable, and certainly effective against those who we wish to deter.
We have, I think, time for one more round of questions and then some last words before we have Prime Minister Netanyahu with us. Madam Fu, here in front of you. Remind everybody who you are.
Thank you. Jeanne encouraged me to ask a question about the Korean nuclear issue, because you said China has the influence, China can get the things done. I want to say that I have to disappoint you that China does not have the magic tool. Otherwise, we wouldn't have waited for the North Koreans to have 6 nuclear tests and continued missile testing. We are in favor, we support the UN sanction regime when we have been on the forefront of sanctions on North Korea. And that has seriously undermined China's bilateral relationship with North Korea. So imagining that China is sitting there and waiting for an opportunity to get the things done is not true. It will only delay your decision. So my question is, that yesterday we had a panel here, and I have a feeling that there is a hope of talks based on the Pyeongchang Olympic opportunities. So do you think the U.S. can get a bipartisan support if the U.S. administration finally gets to get the kind of a decision and the courage and the wisdom and start talking with North Korea?
Okay, let's take a couple more and then we'll come to that one. Madam President.
John Kerry here urged me not to mutter to myself, but to say it out to everybody. The European Union sanctions against Russia, neither the sanctions, counter-sanctions by Russia towards us, they cannot have a big effect on any European economy. I'm Estonian, we share the border, we could benefit from the trade, but nobody even asks the question. It has to be in low single digits. It's simple math. Russia is a market of 140 million people, lower middle income. European Union is a market of 500 million people, high income, and then there is the global market. It is not a considerable economic effect to any economy.
One more question?
That was a comment. She just said it's okay.
John Tripman from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Congratulations, Tori, on your new role, and I'm delighted that we're already in correspondence with each other. I'd like to bring the debate back to the role of the legislative branch in authorizing the use of force. And I'd like to make the following brief comment. I think one of the worst examples of the UK-US special relationship in operation took place in August 2014, when the United States, the United Kingdom, and France had agreed a very precise, time-limited, 24-hour operation in Syria to deter the future use of chemical weapons. And then our Prime Minister, David Cameron, made the rookie error of bringing this precise act of military deterrence to the Parliament for debate. And after that failed, the United States then copied that. And I winced as I saw Secretary Kerry, Secretary Hagel, General Dempsey, over a period of 2 weeks, have that very precise operation unraveled, micromanaged, its ancillary tactical effects looked over, and then the Russians stepped in, and the rest is unfortunate contemporary history in the Middle East. My proposition is that military acts of deterrence need to be the preserve of the executive branch of government, because deterrence requires speed and automaticity, and neither of those factors can operate when there's a debate with the legislative branch. My question is, do you agree?
So, two very provocative questions here. Is the U.S. Congress ready for a deal if we can get one at the table with North Korea? Do you even support going to the table? And shouldn't you guys get out of the way on this use of force thing?
Well, let me start with your question about the use of force. I've been a governor, I've been an executive. I understand that there are certain circumstances where the executive needs to act, and they need to do it without legislation. And I think in the case of Syria, the president should have acted. I think Congress should not have. That should have been done so fast there was no opportunity for Congress to weigh in, because we had drawn a red line and then we refused to enforce it. And as I said, I was one of 10 people on the Foreign Relations Committee and in the Senate who actually voted to take action. So I'm totally with you on that. I think it's a different story when we're talking about long-term engagement in a region that involves tens of thousands of people on the ground that are going to have to sacrifice. And then I think it's important to have public support and to have a real dialogue about what that means.
Not to mention our Constitution, which gives it to Congress the job to declare wars and raise armies.
And are we ready to go to the table?
So, and on your comment of use of force, I certainly would agree with the senators that there is a threshold. I think regime change is probably one of those that ought to go to Congress, and that's why I used the example of Libya. With respect to China, with the representative from China, I was here during your presentation, and during your historical discussion of what we call the Korean War, you left out China's involvement in that conflict, which of course goes to the historical issue of China's relationship with North Korea and the fact that North Korea would not exist in the regime that it's in and the state it's in, but for China's support, which is similarly true for their nuclear program. If China had not permitted that, it would not have occurred. Can you imagine if in Central America or in South America there was a rogue regime that was undertaking a nuclear weapons program and that was threatening Moscow or Beijing? The world would say to the United States that we should intervene and act. And I think that's what the international community is now doing and saying to China, this is your neighbor, this is your partner, and this is something that you need to come to the table and take action for, because it's not only destabilizing, it is an incredibly dangerous threat to millions and millions of people, and there will be no resolution of the Korean Peninsula and its denuclearization without China. Will the United States talk? Of course. But the responsibility for this is going to have to be with the international community and a strong role with China.
Can I add something? I think the challenge that I have in thinking about China's role, and I appreciate the commitment that you've expressed to trying to do something about North Korea. But what I'm having trouble understanding is why your trade with North Korea has actually increased in certain areas, why you've been unwilling to take action with respect to cutting off oil and some of the other necessary supplies that would really cut short North Korea's nuclear efforts. So that's where I think it's hard to understand why there hasn't been more action taken.
And I would add to that some of the facilitators of trade that we know reside in China, and the Chinese government is well aware. Did you want to add anything here? So you all are so popular that Wolfgang has given us an extra 5 minutes, either that or the Prime Minister's doing great issues of state. So we have time for a couple of more questions, if we have any from the audience. Everybody is up in the back there. Thank you. Can't see who it is. Tell us who you are.
Daniel Dresner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I have a question which is unfortunately a little unfair because Senator Risch already left, but he said two things that I think are somewhat contradictory, and perhaps you guys can clarify that. He said simultaneously that we should ignore President Trump's rhetoric when it comes to the transatlantic relationship, that the actions there are what matters, and that therefore the relationship is still very solid. But when it comes to North Korea, we should pay very close attention to what President Trump has said in terms of his threats. So I guess my question to you, and again, it's an unfair question because you don't serve the administration, but when exactly are we supposed to take President Trump's words literally and seriously?
I'm not going to try and explain Senator Risch's comments, so.
All right, anybody?
I would respond in one way, though. I do think that it is a very significant change in facts on the ground when an individual as unconstrained as the leader of North Korea has gained for himself access potentially to an intercontinental ballistic missile system that can deliver a nuclear warhead onto the territory of the United States of America. And whatever Trump might say or whatever Trump might tweet, that is something that has to be taken deadly seriously. And that, I think, is part of our frustration with China. The notion that we're just going to go someplace and talk is fine if people feel a common sense of urgency about solving that problem. But the idea that we in America want to just sit there with somebody as unreliable, bizarre, and unconstrained as this gentleman, one button push away from being able to threaten us with a nuclear weapon, that has to be taken seriously. All Trump's tweets aside, all the bellicosity of what's been said by some of our colleagues aside, that is a fact that demands very sincere attention and not just being put on the back burner with let's go have talks someplace. We've got to be on a path to a result that solves that problem, I think, for anybody here to feel satisfied.
And I think it's important for our European and global colleagues to understand that this is not simply bipartisan, bicameral, executive, legislative. It's broadly felt among the American people that this is becoming existential for us. You know, it's been about 15 years since my children came to dinner and said, "Mama, how worried should we be?" But we're getting that, all of us, at our kitchen tables now. One last question over here, and then let's go to last thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Heike Hensel, member of German Parliament. The remarks of Senator Sheehan on Iran and North Korea and the appeal doing no business with these countries now provokes my question in order to avoid double standards. What about Saudi Arabia waging war in Yemen, oppressing its own people? What about Turkey waging war in Syria, even threatening now the United States with a kind of Ottoman slap? Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on these issues. Thank you.
Well, I share the concern about what Saudi Arabia has done in Yemen and about other threats around the world, and have had the opportunity to speak up in the Senate and with some of those leaders about those concerns.
Congressman Turner?
I think all of those have been part of the U.S. policy, and as the senator said, have been areas where the U.S. has not only had a concern, but has worked to try to address those issues. I think the ones that we dealt with most were the ones, though, that have the opportunity to escalate and to really destabilize areas and certainly the world. Those are the ones I think that are in the forefront of our discussion, but all of those are certainly important issues.
Good. Before we close here, we've talked quite a bit about the regional challenges. We've talked quite a bit about the security challenges that we know well in this family, in this conference that we always come back to. If I had one dispute with our conversation this year, it's that we haven't done as much as we might have in the main hall on some of the big new challenges coming our way, from cyber to artificial intelligence. And so I would offer that as a subject of comment for any of you as you give closing thoughts here. How should we be thinking about this as a Munich security community? How should we be thinking about it as free nations? But also if you have just last thoughts as we end this today. Senator Whitehouse.
Well, I'll close with just joining everyone's sentiment about Senator McCain. This is the first time I've been here that he has not spoken to us, and we miss him very, very dearly. He was a very strong voice is a very strong voice for elected democracy and market capitalism. And the system that we defend here, the West, stands upon elected democracy and market capitalism as the two pillars. And I think that we need to think about the brand of elected democracy and market capitalism in the way we are behaving on certain issues, because I think they create long-term hazards to those institutions. And the two that come to the forefront are climate change and dealing collectively with the failure of American democracy in particular, but all of us, to get ahead of that problem while we still can. That is going to be an indefensible criticism of market capitalism and elected democracy if this gets out of control and we knew all about it and we simply couldn't get our act together. And when you look through and see the political forces that are behind that, particularly the fossil fuel industry, it gets even more nefarious. So that, to me, is a very, very dangerous long-term problem. The other is this business of supporting and enabling the folks on the other side of the clash of civilizations in the non-rule of law world who loot and pillage and engage in criminal activity, and then we provide them shelter in rule of law world. And our lawyers and our accountants and our yacht brokers and our everybody else are in favor and support what is a multi-trillion-dollar shadow industry. Those two things, I think, are like long-term diseases in the body politic of the West, and we need to fix them if we're going to be able to stand up with a straight face and continue to argue for market capitalism and elected democracy in the decades ahead without having black eyes from those two weaknesses. We have got to solve those two things, in my view.
Good. Senator Sheaheen?
Well, thank you, and thank you, Sheldon, for mentioning John McCain. Again, we all miss his presence. You know, as you said, Toria, and as Sheldon has said, the threats that are emerging are different than the past threats. We're not going to see, I think, conventional wars fought again. We're going to see the battlefield in the area of cyber, of disinformation, of the environment, of continued terrorism, and we haven't really developed in lots of ways responses to how to deal with those things. And we don't have rules of engagement around cyber threats, for example. One of the things that the nuclear posture review does is point out that, and I don't agree with this, but it suggests that there might be extreme circumstances when a cyber threat would produce a nuclear response. Now, again, I don't believe we should have a nuclear response in that situation, but it's a clear indication that the threats that we're facing are different, and we need to catch up to those. And to do that, we've got to work together. We've got to think about NATO, about our transatlantic alliance, and how we respond to those new threats in a way that is different than what we've been doing for the last 50 years.
Congressman Turner, last word.
Victoria, I want to echo the Senator's comments with respect to Senator McCain's commitment to this conference. You know, it's not just the dialogue that happens up here, it's the hundreds of meetings that happen around this conference, of the work that gets done on the important issues of security that Senator McCain ensured were worthwhile and were meaningful. And I think his presence is still here in that, even though he's not with us on this trip. Victoria, I also want to thank you, because all the people who are here know you as the contributions that you've made to U.S. policy, the relationships that you have established, and also the work that you have done for the United States. Thank you for continuing to be a strong voice. On cyber, General Petraeus is here, and he's certainly been an advocate for a greater assessment by all of us on both the threats of cyber, its ability to incapacitate our military capability, the stealing of secrets, our commercial effects that could happen, damage that could occur. It's something that not only we need to do on a defensive side, but it's also one where we need to look at how does that play in an offensive function. And I think that needs to be part of the debate, so that we do have an understanding of, as we talk frequently in this conference, shared values, shared goals and objectives. So it's a very good point, Victoria.
Thank you. And I just want to add my comments. Senator McCain is a mentor and a friend to many of us for many things, but especially for the example of bipartisanship that he sets in bringing this delegation every year here, but also in teaching all of us to work together to the extent that we can. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our spectacular congressional panel. We're going to have a minute while we reset.
Thank you. That was fun.